it
Look at
too.
that. That was so good.
I just went after it too, like an implied 3 one time, and then Sam's never gonna let me live it down.
That's okay.
But have you guys
counting to 3 is hard.
Have you guys heard about Tartaria?
What's Tartaria? Daniel.
Tortuga?
It's maybe my favorite conspiracy going. I think it's sort of new, but I say favorite.
Is it a flat Earth one?
It is flat Earth adjacent, but and honestly, probably the overlap between flat earthers and Tartarians. I don't know what they would call themselves.
I like Tartarians.
Tartarians, yeah, but that would also be
only
like
eat raw fish.
raw fish.
Tartarian.
Yeah, well, that actually you talk about that. The steak tartare is the same thing. So basically, on old maps, there would be a land to the sort of east and north, and it would be labeled Tartaria, which really at the time, for the time, was just like, those people over there, we don't know who they are. And there was an actual there was a people that was the Tartars.
They were a steppe nomad tribe.
Yeah, but they
like a Mongol adjacent.
Yeah, but they
flat Earth adjacent, Mongol adjacent.
But either way, they would be on the map like this. They would usually be told as having on the map it would say they had a lot more land than in actuality they had, because they were like, we know those guys are there, and so that's it. But either way, same thing with the old maps where there's like missing continents and
so maps were like people's Instagram back in the day. Like, my life looks a little better than you think.
That's what it is. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but
everybody's gonna look at this map, so yeah, it's big.
Okay,
my land.
I like that. But basically, the belief in Tartaria is that there was a globe spanning, very powerful, epic civilization that basically built all the cool buildings that we have to these days. Like anything with columns or town halls or any sort of like etching or they believe that was built.
Well, so surely you mean like ancient structures, right?
No, like anything that looks decent built basically in the last 200 years.
Wow, talk about taking credit.
Yeah,
if it looks good, it was probably the Tartars.
That's basically the idea, and it's the idea is that if we could build things that look like that now, we would, but since we don't, it means we can't. And so for some reason they think we've lost.
That's why the moon landing's fake, because we're not.
Because we're not back at the moon.
Yeah, I mean,
it's basically the same idea. But either way, that's it. So then it kind of is the idea that like there was a mud flood that covered the world. I don't know how the mud flood worked, but that's why there's buildings like sunk into the ground or something. And then it kind of goes on where it's that whole idea of the Great Reset. But then there's this somewhere in the 1800s. So it's really not that long ago. The Tartars were like overthrown, even though they were like super technologically
right
advanced.
Before the Civil War.
Right before the Civil War, maybe right after.
In America, right?
In America, they were wiped out and overthrown, and then they've erased history. There was a massive war. So then that kind of gets into where like there's these old postcards with like Cabbage Patch Babies and all these things about like incubators being developed in the early 1900s, and they believe that people were like cloning babies to like repopulate the earth after the giant reset where they wiped out the Tartars. So like, it's pretty cool. It's pretty cool stuff. It's pretty cool stuff.
See, I'm a big fan of ancient civilization theories and all of that kind of Graham Hancock stuff. It's so much fun, and a lot of it I find very plausible as far as an Ice Age civilization.
Yeah.
I love that these guys just say no, it's not that far back. It was 200 years ago.
Basically 200 years ago. So
everything else in human history is they made it up.
So then it's like Tesla was doing the free power thing because they had free power, and then it's also that like the World's Fairs were going around destroying all the Tartarian architecture is really what they were doing. They weren't actually building any of it. They were just destroying it. And basically like, before we blow all this stuff up, let's have a party is kind of the vibe. Wow. So
that is a vibe.
But is there any connection to tartar sauce, like, at all? Because why is it called...
shit, Sam. I think you may have just uncovered something.
I mean, I was on the fence about the whole thing, but if tartar sauce is the last remaining thing, like mustard and mayonnaise and pickles...
in one sauce.
That is absolutely a sign. I don't know a sign of what, but...
the last remains of the tartar is in the sauce.
I think that I am now a Tartarian.
I'm a Tartarian if it gets me tartar sauce.
Yep,
I'm already a flat earther, so...
Hello, my Govanen, and welcome to Undertowers, your library for all things nerdy and sci-fi and fantasy, especially books. I'm Steven.
I'm Daniel.
I'm Sam.
And we have a great episode for you guys tonight. Man, hell of a start. Love that. First, some news. The first two pieces of news that I've got for you guys both come from the Annecy Film Festival in France, which is the largest animation film festival / business event in the world, I believe. Certainly one of the most prestigious, if not the most prestigious. Got a couple pieces for you from here. So I am not familiar with this studio, but there's an anime studio, Studio Ponok. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that. Apologies. Which is founded by Studio Ghibli veteran Yoshiaki Nishimura. Founded this new studio when it was looking like Ghibli was going to go under. They've made a film previously. They've been doing some things like in advertising and stuff like that. But they just debuted their new film, The Imaginary, at Annecy. It's based on a book by A.F. Harold. It's the story of a young girl and her imaginary friends. And apparently the early reviews that I've seen have said that it has a serious Calvin and Hobbes vibe,
that sounds great.
Which is a big A+ for me. And then that will be, I believe, already going to Netflix next month. So July,
awesome.
Early July. So that should be fun. And then the second piece that I'm unbelievably stoked for, it's another anime piece of news, is that the first footage from Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim was shown.
Yep.
They showed 20 minutes of footage at the actual festival, and it was received with wild acclaim. Everybody was just freaking out about it. Yeah, and they did release 3 images kind of stacked on top of each other, showing Helm himself, who is voiced by Brian
Cox.
I keep wanting to say Brian Blessed, which would have been
that would also
amazing.
Be awesome.
Brian Cox,
but
the
Brian
Blessed.
Cox is is gonna. I mean, he's gonna kill it.
We are so back.
I mean, what a commanding
So
voice he has.
So bad.
Could you imagine him doing a podcast?
We have never
Brian
been more
Cox?
back.
Well, he's got. There's a whole series, I believe, on YouTube of him just pronouncing, like doing the proper pronunciation for Scotch names,
Okay.
and it's stunning.
Have you seen Paul Rudd's YouTube?
He also does McDonald's
Yes.
commercials.
Yeah.
Yes.
Anyways, let's get back on
so
news.
so he's playing Helm, and so that first image was of Helm Hammerhand himself sitting on his throne. Second image was of Wolf, the leader of the Dunlendings, that is fighting against Helm. And then the third image was of a new character, which is Helm's daughter, Hera, who's one of the lead characters of the film. Predictably, a bunch of fucking dorks are up in arms about a new female character being added, but...
Yeah, and then Boyens has even talked about, like, which, I don't want to even do this, but she said she's not a girl boss, she's not the whole thing too, so, like, I think it's going to be great.
It's going to be incredible.
She's an invention by the studio, so, and I understand some people being... Whenever there's an invented character, there's some trepidation, but I think there's no reason to be worried about this at all.
Not at all. Bronn was the best part of Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
Before it got really
you're
bad.
Not wrong.
Before it got really bad, he was the best part of it.
But let's also be real. Like the Helm Hammerhand story, as far as I can recall from the text, you know about Helm and you know about Wolf, and that's
about Wolf,
that's it.
And the daughter's hand is Aston married, but she's not named.
Yeah.
But not a lot of characters are named. There's like
hardly any.
3 or 4 people named. Yeah.
There's a whole army, right, of like lots of people.
Super stoked. And the only other thing I saw that stood out to me as far as news from that is that Miranda Otto is back as
nice.
As Éowyn.
Yes,
That's
and
great.
she's like the narrator of the film.
Yes.
So
I almost said over voicing.
yeah, but Éowyn has always been one of my favorite characters, so I'm stoked for her to be in it.
I still don't really get Aragorn's decision not to go for Éowyn.
Okay, well
that's a hot take, but it's not one that I disagree with. And then
yes, you know what I mean.
Third and final piece of news is we haven't talked about this, so I don't know if you guys know about this.
So it's really
but there is a new Dragon Ball Z Budokai Tenkaichi game coming out.
Okay.
It's called Dragon Ball Z Sparking Zero.
Different than the one we played at your house the other day?
Correct. Yes. It's still a fighting game, but I think it is the continuation of the game that we talked about in the last episode, I believe.
Interesting.
That original Budokai series.
Yes.
And
Gosh, that's been like a lot of time.
Yeah, well, it looks sick. Looks like it's going to be a lot of fun. Really great looking fighting game, and it has an actual release date of October 11th.
Nice.
And pre-orders are up now, but don't pre-order video games.
Is that all the platforms as well?
I believe so, yes.
Nice.
Yep, everywhere.
Like Switch?
I think so.
Nice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could be wrong, but I believe it's going everywhere.
Nice.
At least all consoles. So that is our news. We got a couple topics that we're going to talk to you guys about tonight. We're going to be talking about sword and sorcery generally, but we're also going to be talking about two of our favorite authors that we've been reading, both Mr. Robert E. Howard and Saint Gene Wolfe. But before we dive into that, a word from our sponsor.
Yeah, and we're very pleased to have our first sponsor for Under Towers podcast.
So grateful. So grateful.
Yeah, we're really it's a big step for us, and we're really stoked. So, our first sponsor is this podcast is brought to you by Black Coast Shapewear. Are you not feeling supple and live? Then Black Coast Shapewear is for you. Displays that supple and live form for the world you've always wanted, with the form-fitting and flexibility-enhancing, patented and groundbreaking supplification nanofibers. Tame that inner queen and outer barbarian with Black Coast Shapewear. We're really happy to have them on board as a sponsor.
Yes.
And we just we hope you can, there'll be a link to Black Coast Shapewear in the show notes. You can go there and you can buy as much of it as you can handle.
Hey, it's Barbarian Summer. It's Pirate Queen Summer.
Absolutely.
So get you some Black Coast shapewear. Thank you, Black Coast, for sponsoring tonight's episode.
Right. Supple yourself.
That was good. All right. So what is sword and sorcery?
No one knows.
It sounds great together,
awesome.
though, those words.
So sword and sorcery, if you are unfamiliar with the subgenre, is kind of one of the two kind of founding subgenres of fantasy. And
Hi, baby.
so sweet.
Daughter invasion.
Yep. Okay, time for bed. Good night.
Night.
Night. I think we should leave that in.
I think we should too. We'll leave this in.
Right, we'll go back.
We'll leave it.
Okay. All right. We'll go back. So we can cut at the advertisement.
Yep.
All right. So
Yeah, I don't want to say supple and live, and then my 5-year-old comes in.
oh God. All right.
Now we should leave
Here we
it
go.
in.
Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah.
So, what is sword and sorcery? If you're unfamiliar, we knew it as a concept. I actually honestly was more familiar with movies in the sword and sorcery genre than I was with literature before we got started.
Probably same.
As far as more than just being like a concept.
Yeah.
But sword and sorcery, as far as the subgenre of fantasy goes, I think you could consider one of the two kind of founding subgenres of modern fantasy. Mm-hmm. The other being, Tolkienian epic fantasy.
Yep.
Interestingly enough, kind of starting around the same time, even though Tolkien didn't start publishing until I want to say it was 3 or 4 years after Robert E. Howard died.
So crazy. So crazy.
But they kind of emerged parallel to each other in a lot of ways. But where Tolkien, as we'll discuss in the future and we'll be exploring in the future, was coming from more of a mythic tradition, more of a heroic romance tradition, and getting inspiration from previous fantasy authors like Lord Dunsany and George MacDonald. Mm-hmm. Robert E. Howard, who is the father of sword and sorcery, was drawing inspiration more from the pulp adventure stories that were being written around in the early 20th century. So let's talk about Robert E. Howard for a second.
Rest in peace.
Rest in peace. Absolute genius. We're actually all older than him.
Yeah,
Which is kind of a
wild.
trippy
That's
thought.
crazy.
Obviously,
and on a sad note, his when this is coming out, just a week or so ago, his the 88th anniversary of his passing just happened.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Probably most known for having written Conan the Barbarian, creating that character, and writing a bunch of short stories and one novel involving Conan. But he also wrote Call the Conqueror. Yes. He wrote Solomon Kane, several other series around other characters. But he kind of created what was to become known as Sword and Sorcery, everything that came after. He's the North Star, just the same way as J.R.R. Tolkien is for epic fantasy. He, like I mentioned, not only was he gaining inspiration from the pulp stories, that's also where the majority of his writing was being published, was in pulp adventure magazines. He wrote for quite a few of them. One of them, what was that one called? There was one I saw today that was like, it was literally called like Spicy Adventure Magazine or something. Spicy was in the title, so It was a sexy magazine. But I think the one that he wrote mostly for was Weird Tales.
Okay. Yeah. Yes, that is correct.
So crazy that's how people would like digest stories like that.
No, and it's one of those things that pulp magazines and the short story in general used to be a huge piece of the ecosystem for both just literature and for a certain kind of fantasy and sci-fi, just both fantasy and sci-fi storytelling. Most authors cut their teeth telling short stories, or many of them did, and
there was a real market for them at the time, that early 20th century, especially. I mean,
really
in this genre,
the 60s, I'd say, and then I think that's when it starts to die off.
But through the adventure stuff, especially, there was a huge audience, the male audience. Reading is not frequently considered a very manly pastime for whatever stupid reason.
Yeah.
But there were all these magazines that were full of kind of male fantasy adventure stuff, and Conan fit right in there. It was just kind of taking that Tarzan idea, kind of superhero character, and then putting it in a purely fantastical world, rather than someplace that's actually physically on Earth right now.
Yeah.
And I know that one thing I loved about the Conan stories, there are some kind of recognizable barbarian tribes from history, and my understanding is that that Howard was fascinated with the idea of the barbarian, and he actually, we'll get this out of the way, and then we're not going to talk about it anymore. Howard is a product of his time, and so there are certain things in his writing that would not fly today. Take that or leave it. But he had some really interesting things to say about. I think he kind of admired and held up on pedestals the idea of the barbaric man and the less civilized man much more than he did civilization, and especially the modern industrialized man.
Yeah, there's definitely it's interesting with Conan. The stories are just enjoyable on their face. Like you said, as an adventure story, they're usually very fast paced. They're usually really gripping. And there is often a certain formula to them, although as he wrote more of them, there are twists and turns that are unexpected. Mm-hmm. But behind that surface level of sort of a pop entertainment figure and story and form, there really is a worldview of the I would guess like the self-made man, or the man who overcomes adversity basically at all costs. It's a very Nietzschean sort of will to power, that Conan does what Conan wants to do, no matter what. And, you know, sometimes for better and for worse. Generally speaking, though, Conan is a pretty good guy, at least in all the stories that we read, which is all of them. He does the right thing. He helps people. But at the same time, he's not very worried about, especially in the things he says, he's not very worried about the way people feel or what's the right thing to do in each situation. He does the thing that's straight ahead of him, and then also tries to advance his own interests as much as possible. And I do think you can see that as, if you take that to like a sort of archetypal level, it's sort of you as an individual being yourself in the world. Not that doing that will be entirely selfless or selfish, or needs to be, but that to be yourself, you have to cast aside all the pressures and anxieties and things that want to, you know, hold you down. And I think the appeal to these stories is not when you layer lots of societal context on them, but you take it as like, I'm going to overcome the demon beast. I'm going to conquer these tribes and these people. And it's really, it's not even, it stops being about what it's about, and it's more just the struggle to live and the will to, you know, be a human in the world is kind of what it ends up meaning to me. I don't know.
Yeah, I like that, and that explanation also kind of reminds me of that. I believe I sent it to you guys, that G.K. Chesterton quote that I saw the other day. I'm gonna paraphrase it so I don't take time looking it up here, but it was something like, fairy tales don't exist to tell children that there are dragons. Fairy tales exist to tell children that dragons can be beaten.
Yeah, right.
That just reminded me of that a little bit. But yeah, it's the morals of Conan. He does always end up stepping in and doing the right thing and helping people. And he for sure has a code. He doesn't rape. He doesn't kill women. He doesn't kill children. Everything else is kind of on the table, though. Like
stealing, taking.
He's a thief in some stories. He's a pirate in a lot of stories. He definitely kills a lot of men, and I think that's one of the most important distinctions between epic fantasy and sword and sorcery, and also one of the most important tropes of sword and sorcery is that morally gray hero.
Yeah.
Not necessarily what we would maybe modernly call an anti-hero, but that morally gray character that's not, he's not doing what's right because it's right. Yeah. He's not a knight in shining armor. He's a barbarian, and so he's gonna do what he wants.
So, and while we're focusing this discussion on Howard, it is interesting to see the way that trope bleeds in and then informs at least the sword and sorcery works that we read. You get that a lot in Paul Anderson's Broken Sword, where there are good and bad characters, but there's a real blurring of the lines of what's going on and how these characters are in that story are wrapped up in fate. You get in Fafhrd and Grey Mouser, while Fafhrd and Grey Mouser, for the most part, are good guys and try to be nice. They also are conniving little bastards.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, they're straight up a thief and a barbarian.
They're kind of doing whatever makes sense to them. And then in Elric is also, and especially in the earlier stories, Elric is actually a pretty bad guy.
Yeah, Moorcock kind of loses sight of that in some of the later stories, but
he's a good guy who's like basically forced by the destiny of his sword to then be bad, but he's also the eternal champion. There's and Moorcock kind of changed his view on it,
God level stuff coming into play with that one.
No, it is, but there's that same idea. Although then Elric really is an inversion of Conan, so it's so that one is sort of different. But again, there's a sameness there where Conan really is like he is a man doing his thing. Where interestingly, also in most of, especially Howard's longer Conan stories, Conan is almost not the main character. There's another character that we get viewpoint for a lot of the story, who is the more the emotional resonance of the story, whether it's them needing to be saved or them going along with Conan for the ride. Because Conan and except for maybe the novel, maybe Conan never really learns a lesson. Conan never changes, never develops. for the most part. He doesn't even really gain skills. He's mostly big and strong and never shirks back from a challenge. He does have fears. It's not that he's perfect, and he does get beaten sometimes, and captured, and so it's not like he can always overcome and win, at least in each individual moment. But because of Conan's like mindset being so set and one-sided, Howard often has to put in this other character who is going to learn something or is going to overcome a challenge in a different way and develop, because that's not what Conan's there for.
Yep. That reminds me of we were kind of talking. We'll throw some other things out as we're talking here, but some kind of movies or other stories that are newer, that are kind of obviously influenced by sword and sorcery in general. And this take reminded me very much of Mad Max.
Yeah.
Because pretty much every Mad Max movie, Max it's not his story.
Yeah.
He just is trying to survive.
He's caught up in something.
He doesn't want to be around anybody else, and he gets caught up in other people's problems. And because deep down he is a good guy,
Yeah.
He does eventually end up helping with whatever problem this is. But Fury Road is probably the best example. Fury Road, arguably, it's a Mad Max movie, but it's Furiosa's story. Mm-hmm. It's just that Mad Max himself has gotten caught up in Furiosa's story.
Right. Yeah, so that's where I can chime in with the whole sorcery part of Sword and Sorcery, I think, is, to me, that element of, like, the unknown, the surprise, the thing that does take you on this adventure, but, like, you would not have gone on that or not have wanted to be in it at any point in time. Mm-hmm. And I think Conan's character is kind of reflecting that sort of idea with his hesitancy or fear almost, or, like a avoidance of anything extraordinary or supernatural. He's like, that's weird. I don't want to go near that. But then all of a sudden there's a demon like made of smoke in front of him. And he's like, I'm going to try to choke it. You know what I mean?
Or a crazy wizard. That's a good point, because you could almost look at the whole title of Sword and Sorcery from the Conan perspective. Conan has no magic abilities.
No resistance, nothing.
He's just like,
pure
sword.
And magic is almost always evil and bad.
Almost
and
always.
Strange, and that he does in a couple...
Unless you're a healer. Healers are nice.
There are a couple healers, and he does actually use to overcome one villain and the name of the story escapes me right now, but he does get a sash that allows him to overcome...
Yeah, it's the Four Priests story.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's it, yes. Yeah. The one that's like set in sort of a prehistory India.
But even that one, if I remember correctly, he's given that sash by a dying sorcerer,
and he
who was a bad guy previously in the story.
And he doesn't even barely know what it is, but he's like, you take this, and he like wears it, and he's like, okay, and it allows him to overcome the sorcery. But yeah, he talks very explicitly, but I do think there's actually... I think the fact, at least in Conan, that all the sorcery is bad, which actually is not always the case. Elric is a sorcerer, and in Fafhrd they have wizard patrons. So
that's where you kind of... It's like a progression.
It's a progression.
Because Fafhrd has the god influence, and then Elric is all about that god destiny influence, and Conan is like... not. But he's still caught up in the same swirl.
It's man striving against the forces of nature and the forces that, and like anything not, and I think in Conan especially, magic is anything you can't understand.
Yes.
It's just, can I overcome this thing I don't understand? It's kind of like the forces of fate and destiny, and like, or anything, just like, honestly, to put it in a modern perspective. And I think my guess is this is what Howard was, intentionally or not, trying to be like, can you overcome like running into unexpected traffic? I mean, which is like silly. I don't know. I guess they don't really. I don't know if that did they have bad traffic in this.
What time
Probably
frame was
not.
it?
Probably certainly not
so
what it's considered now.
Traffic is not a good example. But like, I mean, maybe the depression,
in general,
the stock market crashing, political forces and machinations that you have nothing to do with.
But you have to deal
rampant
with
inflation out of nowhere. Businesses closing, jobs, things, all these things in life that there is so much in our lives that's out of control.
Well, and for Howard, I mean, he was too young to have served, but
yes,
was old enough for sure to have been aware of the First World War.
Boy, and lived through the
And-
Depression.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
But so
Part of
where
Well,
is
part of it. Yeah. I mean,
where
RIP.
is the
Well, the crash was in 29.
yeah.
So
So he was
lived
in there.
Like 5
He
years
was in
of it.
there.
5 years of it.
So with those parallels drawn, my next parallel that I want to draw desperately but can't find it is what is the real world equivalent of a gray ape at that time?
Okay.
The thing that exists in all of these are just gray apes, and for
Well,
some
There's a lot of
reason-
gray apes.
I'm not sure if there's a parallel, but it is another trope of sword and sorcery is that the fantastical creatures.
Yeah.
It's not just like there's
It's
the
like they
unknown.
read
with-
Tarzan and imagined all of these like monkeys
Sure.
with fangs. They're like, yeah.
Well, but it's like
That's the bad
it's
guy.
there's the so again tracing lineage of sword and sorcery back to adventure pulp fiction, there is that like questing out into the unknown places with new fantastical creatures, and then getting to go further with that because it's literal fantasy, and I think the gray
Yeah.
apes certainly your favorite, Sam.
Well, it's just always like, and he's like, and you know what? Things got bad, and all of a sudden, a gray ape appeared.
It
And
can
things
always
got
get worse.
way worse. Yeah.
It
Okay,
can
I've
always
got a
be
theory
gray.
though. I've got a theory
About the
again.
apes? Lay
What
it
Howard
on
was
us.
doing again at it.
Is it like Darwinism, like
at the
missing
deeper?
links
Well,
stuff?
this is kind of what I'm saying.
Same
That's
time,
kind of where
right?
I'm going to go. But so when Conan fights, Conan has several enemies. He's usually either a sorcerer, a mythical monster, and then occasionally a gray ape. Usually the gray ape is.
But
not
he's
like
got
the main
99
villain.
problems, but a bitch ain't one, right?
But when Conan battles with a sorceress human, that's Conan. But and sometimes it is a primeval force that in the novel specifically it is a resurrected sorcerer. But that is Conan battling with the forces of the modern world, in my opinion. When he's battling magic, it's the forces of advancement and human conniving in power. When Conan battles monsters, that is man's battle with nature and maybe the spiritual and psychological forces of just being human is what I think those symbolize.
It's more commonplace.
And then I think maybe, and I'm sorry, but I think the gray ape is potentially because Darwinism would have just been doing it. It's like the gray ape might be Conan battling the history of humanity itself. Wow.
damn.
I like that.
And
But
that
I don't
is
know.
what they were the Tartars.
The Tartars. They were the
are
Tartars.
gray apes.
Oh my
The
God!
Tartars-
It all
yeah,
comes back
it
together.
comes
And
back.
that's why we were talking. Wow, that's so full circle, Dave.
Here's one of my favorite things about this conversation that we're in the middle of, and that I think points back to another a big misconception about Conan the Barbarian. People who haven't read Conan would probably listen to us right now and be like, "Jesus, guys, you are way overanalyzing this. It's a barbarian story." But I would like to point out that the very first story that Robert E. Howard wrote with Conan, I believe it's called "The Phoenix on the Sword."
Yes.
It's old man King Conan. He's uncovered a plot against him, and
Well, and the
has
whole
found
story
that,
opens, and it's not even Conan there. It's just
right.
the plot.
Yeah, it's very like opening to Henry V.
Yes.
Actually. But Conan discovers that one of the main conspirators is this very famous poet whose work he admires very much, even though a lot of it has been anti-Conan. And he laments the fact that he's going to have to kill a poet. And so, like, there's this whole level of Conan that's not always shown, but it's under the surface of he's not just a dumb brute.
No.
He's actually very intelligent and very sensitive in some ways, in ways that you wouldn't expect. And I think that's a big misconception that's been lost in a lot of the, like, obviously every D&D barbarian has Conan deeply in its DNA. And I think that's one thing that gets lost, when you're playing D&D and you're putting your stats together, you're not putting a single bit in intelligence.
Yeah.
And so there's this idea of, just dumb as rocks hit things until they fall over barbarian, whereas, the grandfather of all barbarians in literature and in fantasy in general was actually a remarkably intelligent and resilient.
No,
and,
yeah. Conan's a very good problem solver.
Yeah.
Well, that's where I was like when we were talking about the character. Like honestly, I think Christopher Nolan can't escape writing a character just like Conan in like literally any of his movies. There's always a dude who's like pretty like stoic, but like means to do well, is attached to a family or someone in some way, and has to rise up and save everyone. And they're able to do it because of their intelligence and their strength or tenacity or endurance or perseverance or something. Like any movie I can think of, I'm like, yeah, that character exists. And I love all of them so much. But right now I'm kind of feeling a connection with that character archetype and also Conan the Barbarian.
Yeah. One thing I think that's very interesting, kind of along those lines you're mentioning there, Sam, is that we don't really get any background information from Conan.
Right.
We don't get his backstory. We know vaguely where he's from.
He's in his 30s though.
We don't
probably
get
late 20s. Like, they say that he used to be in the like frost area.
I guess
that's the only backstory.
There's an age range though, because he's a king at one point, and then he's a pirate. So there's bebop
and
around.
like,
There's younger Conan and older Conan.
Yeah, my favorite, and I can't remember exactly how we ranked all the stories, but I know it was very high if it wasn't number one. But Tower of the Elephant.
Yeah, I think he's the youngest Conan. Yeah,
and he's like probably 18, 19.
Yeah,
I think in that one. So there's definitely a
Oh, so
Tower of the Elephant.
And that's the one that's like also straight up a science fiction story too. Yes. It's not just a fantasy story.
But we don't get like I guess an 18 or 19 is pretty young, but we still don't get like. And one of the things I like about it is because every time we get a story nowadays, it's I saw a joke recently that's if they made a show called Vampire Surfer, that in the olden days that guy would be surfing every episode, but now if they made a show called Vampire Surfer, he wouldn't start surfing till the last episode, and the whole thing would be the preamble of how the guy loved surfing and then his backstory and how his troubled past led him to surfing, and then he'd be surfing for 5 minutes at the very end of the last episode.
And it sets up season 2 great.
So Conan is that exactly where he is doing Conan things the entire time, and we never get some troubled backstory about how he was abused as a kid or how he was troubled and why he left his homeland and it was hard up there and that's why he is where he is. We don't get any of that.
Yeah.
Conan just is who he is. And it's very refreshing reading it now compared to it. But the interesting thing is in the Conan movies, we do get a backstory.
Yeah,
we
it's
get
always
a sympathetic backstory,
his tribe getting destroyed and he's enslaved. And
the interesting thing there is that's a Kull the Conqueror story. So it's sort of a blending of Robert E. Howard's two characters because Kull, unlike Conan, I think there are some similarities in the two, but Kull is a more sympathetic and kind-hearted character than Conan. Not that Conan is cruel, but he's got more of that backstory. He's got some things he overcame in that direction where Conan doesn't. They thought to make audiences care about him, they wanted to blend those two things. So it's interesting that even in the film adaptation we've actually got a non-Conan story informing the Conan story to make people, to make an 80s audience care a little more.
Interesting.
Did it work?
I mean, it's fine. It's cool, and the whole what is it? The Wheel of Pain is awesome.
That is a Conan story,
and led to. They've recreated that now for the Strongman events.
Oh yeah,
which is wild.
Crazy.
So we've touched on quite a few of the tropes of sword and sorcery, just talking about Conan. Short form. Mm-hmm. It's almost always short stories.
Short stories, and then even when they're novels, they are 150, 250 pages.
Yeah,
like novellas, right? More like novellas.
It's probably what they'd be called now. Yeah. Like Broken Sword is one of the only straight up novels that we read in the sword and sorcery genre, and it's not very long at all.
It's not very long. Yeah,
I would have loved for it to be longer, frankly. All that, so he gets to Ireland and then just comes back and is like, wait, there's a whole adventure there. So it morally great characters, adventure, very violent. Again, that's kind of harkening back to that.
Insanely violent for the time. Like the stuff he writes, I couldn't even see being written.
Well, it was very much written for a male audience.
Yeah.
And so it is that adult kind of audience, that violent adventure fantasy that we all have.
I'm just impressed.
Oh yeah, no, it's phenomenal. And one thing I do want to point out about Robert E. Howard, he wrote a bunch of stuff in a very short lifespan.
Yeah.
Some of it not good, some of it very mediocre. When Robert E. Howard was on, I'll go back to Tower of the Elephant, and that's one of the best things that we've read.
I think that's our segue to Gene Wolfe for sure.
I do want to touch before we jump over to Gene Wolfe, because once you go Gene, there's no turning back.
Not for a while.
I did want to talk about the legacy of Sword and Sorcery, because unfortunately it's not. I think there's maybe a resurgence because of the internet and the resurgence of online magazines and online magazines that then can there's companies that can do prints of them, so you can still have a physical copy, or you can just buy the digital copy. And I do want to shout out a few of those magazines that are still running old school Sword and Sorcery short stories.
Oh, nice.
There's New Edge Sword and Sorcery, Heroic Fantasy Quarterly, Old Moon, Whetstone, Savage World Monthly, and then this is one of the greatest and most Sword and Sorcery names I've ever heard in my entire life. Are you ready?
Yeah, okay.
Tales from the Magician's Skull. That is like pure, uncut Sword and Sorcery. That's an absolutely incredible title. Whoever came up with that deserves
I can add
a raise.
Sir Sova magazine to that list too.
Yeah.
They're doing great work.
And anybody that's listening, if you have others, post them up in comments wherever you're listening to this, because we'd love to check them out.
Yep.
But grimdark and heroic fantasy, two subgenres that broke off from both Sword and Sorcery and epic fantasy in roughly the 80s. Those would not exist without Sword and Sorcery. Obviously, they break off from Sword and Sorcery. That's going to be an influence. But as far as the morally gray characters, the violence level, the adventurous aspects, a lot of these things and characters that we love in these other subgenres of fantasy wouldn't be here without Sword and Sorcery. Mentioned it briefly with just talking about the barbarian class, but Dungeons and Dragons is straight up Sword and Sorcery.
Yes. More than anything else, yeah.
Yeah, because it's essentially Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser.
Yep.
Every Dungeons and Dragons campaign I've been on, no matter how serious it is, eventually, even if it's just one or two filler adventures, it's just a group of buddies going off on wacky adventures and causing a ruckus and stealing a bunch of stuff.
Yep.
And killing a bunch of stuff and
trying to serve a patron wizard Ningobble.
Yeah, well, it's patron wizard, or it's but it's funny because there's like the trappings. D&D kind of has the trappings and the cover, the face of like an epic fantasy, Tolkienian fantasy.
Yeah.
But at its heart, it's Sword and Sorcery.
I totally agree. I totally agree. And they're like, sure, playing out an epic fantasy is something that a lot of people were trying to do, but it absolutely is the adventure stories and the both silliness and vibrancy of the Sword and Sorcery world.
Yep. So, final closing thoughts on Sword and Sorcery.
It's great.
Yeah, we kind of started this by saying that we were going into this exploration of Sword and Sorcery, not really that familiar with the literature side of it. So, thoughts now that we're wrapping this series of our book club up.
I really enjoyed it. There were things I enjoyed less than others, but overall, I'm thinking about it more, but I might enjoy the genre more than epic fantasy, to be honest, as a genre. I love the fast-paced storytelling, the way tropes and ideas can be engaged with, and in a similar way than they are at epic fantasy. But I actually feel like overall there's maybe even more creative license in Sword and Sorcery, where Epic actually follows. Well, they both do this, but they both follow certain tropes. But there's just a really wide array of storytelling. At least there was early on, which is interesting because there's a lot of criticism now that Sword and Sorcery is like rote and it's kind of all been done and everything written now is a Conan pastiche. But you mentioned some publications. There are some authors, Alexander Palacio and Skylar Hernstrom, who are writing in that mode, but telling stories, at least to me, that I've read that are very fresh, and absolutely are hearkening back to what Robert Howard and other authors were doing, but adding a flair to it where they're using this story format to without directly ever saying it, they're talking about modern themes and modern issues and struggles in a way that I think are really compelling and powerful. But I have nothing but enjoyed the look and journey we've been on, even if I haven't always enjoyed everything we've read. But I don't know. Those are my feelings for the most part.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I feel like there's still a lot of opportunity in it, just because of reading Moorcock, really, and seeing where he took it, because I think the direction he headed was such a step forward in taking it to a new space, but kind of like, I don't know, fizzled out on itself or had too many conflicting ideas. The thing about the sorcery bit of it, though, is it's really hard because there's no set structure of rules for the sorcery. It can kind of just be a fire blast comes and destroys everything, and I think we've even talked about how sometimes it's like an overwhelming power. It's like, if they can just do a fire blast, why don't they just fire blast it constantly if there's no rules surrounding it? And why is nobody just listening to that dude? That's
fair. I will say I didn't run into that as much in most of the Sword and Sorcery stories we read. That does come up in more modern things where there's just like, I feel like there's which I do feel like there's a more modern take on magic that happens where you've just got people like pushing things around and like unrestrained uses of force. But I actually don't feel like that came up in at least Conan as much.
No, but that's what I'm saying. Like Elric was a little bit.
It did it a little bit in Elric, but Elric actually has some nice things where I feel like because you have to call on you're
reliant on somebody else to do it.
I actually felt like that actually made the magic like believable.
That's why I'm saying I feel like there's a lot of opportunity, because I think even amongst us and our club, like we have talked about how exciting some of Moorcock's ideas were, and then there's like
Some of the execution was not.
The execution just didn't,
ideas.
It was really excited, like, oh, okay.
And not to sidetrack this conversation, but it was kind of silly though in Elric, and when it was more stories where it's like Elric encounters a problem, Elric remembers there's somebody he can help him, get him to help with this problem. Elric can't remember for a while how to do it, then does remember, then the guy saves the day. And it was like, that was kind of, not every story, but it was a lot of
quite frequent.
Those were the good ones too.
They were, honestly.
Yeah. So there's more opportunity, I think, in this really kind of, I guess, old class of genre.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's where I'm at with it. I loved it. I think it's cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with both of you. I was very. I don't want to say I was surprised, because I knew I was going to enjoy it. Like I loved the Conan movies growing up. Willow is maybe my favorite Sword and Sorcery movie and has been for forever.
Yes, so good.
So it's from the movie side, I was already a big fan, so I had a feeling I was going to really love diving into it, but I enjoyed it even more than I anticipated. And it's a subgenre that a lot of it really resonated with me. A lot of the tropes and the settings and everything were a lot of fun. Some of them were, there was a surprising, I guess, to me, number of truly deep and thoughtful stories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But beyond that, there was just fun. It was just fun to read.
Yeah.
It was fun worlds and fun characters. With especially once we got into Fafhrd and Grey Mouser, some just genuinely hilarious stories.
Some of the funniest things I've ever read.
Truly. And so there's just such a wide array of emotions and feelings that across from these stories, and just a blast to read. So it's a subgenre I look forward to reading more in the future, and I'm glad that this is how we kind of started these series off.
Absolutely.
So yeah, long live sword and sorcery.
Woo!
Now topic 2. Let's pour some whiskey for this.
All right.
And we're gonna get some other props here.
Props.
And
these glasses say Undertowers on it.
Yes.
Yeah, shout out to Charlie Young. Thanks, man, so much for these glasses and this decanter with our Undertowers on it.
Put it right in the center of that shot.
There it is. And what are we drinking?
As we were about to talk about the man, the master, the myth, the legend, Gene Wolfe, I got a barrel pick from Main Street Liquors, a wonderful liquor store that's near where I live, by Rittenhouse Rye. Here's the bottle there, and this is a barrel pick because so from one singular barrel, because Gene Wolfe is such a singular author. And it's
you're not wrong.
It's barrel strength, and because his writing's so powerful. But most importantly, it is a rye whiskey, which I've recently been reading Bard Skull by Martin Shaw, who's a great sort of mythicist, and he talks about this as well as this comes up in the Golden Bough, the wonderful history of mythic and legendary practice, the comparative history of that. But they talk about the Rogan wolf, the rye wolf, and the rye has had a connotation with wolves for a long time, both as a spirit animal, a sort of werewolf that would live in the rye that you would need to honor so that nothing bad would happen to you while you harvested. But I think it also, the connotation just came because I think often wolves would just be hanging out in the tall grass and the tall rye corn. And so with Gene Wolfe being who we are, I thought this was the perfect beverage for this.
Hell yeah.
This discussion.
To Gene.
To Gene.
The original Tartarian.
Oh my God, that's good. I'm not a rye guy. That is good.
That is very good.
Woo!
Also,
it's strong too.
Are we going to share some fun facts about Gene?
Also, so we got some Pringles. And
before he was a writer,
so
he was scorching.
Well, let's leave some suspense here for a second.
Okay.
Can I? I'd like to start.
Spoiler.
I'd like to start before we just start gushing. If I may, excuse me. I have some quotes about Gene Wolfe here.
I'm ready.
These are. It should be noticed. All of these quotes are from fellow authors.
Great.
So from Michael Swanwick. Gene Wolfe is the greatest writer in the English language alive today. Let me repeat that. Gene Wolfe is the greatest writer in the English language alive today. I mean it. Shakespeare was a better stylist, Melville was more important to American letters, and Charles Dickens had a defter hand at creating characters. But among living writers, there is nobody who can even approach Gene Wolfe for brilliance of prose, clarity of thought, and depth of meaning. Then Harlan Ellison, when he was reviewing Shadow of the Torturer, wrote, Gene Wolfe is engaged in the holy chore of writing every other author under the table. He is no less than one of the finest, most original writers in the world today. His work is singular, hypnotizing, startlingly above comparison. The Shadow of the Torturer breaks new ground in American literature and, as the first novel of a tetralogy, casts a fierce light on what will certainly be a lodestone landmark, his most stunning work to date. It is often said, but never more surely than this time, this book is not to be missed at peril of one's intellectual enrichment. Ursula K. Le Guin, this is a quote that you'll see on most of the book covers. Wolfe is our Melville.
Yeah.
Referring to, obviously, sci-fi and fantasy in general. And then finally, two quotes from Neil Gaiman. Firstly, this was from a speech that Neil Gaiman gave when he was introducing Wolfe at the World Horror Convention, where he was the guest of honor. Gaiman said, there are two kinds of clever writer, the ones that point out how clever they are, and the ones who see no need to point out how clever they are. Gene Wolfe is of the second kind, and the intelligence is less important than the tale. He is not smart to make you feel stupid. He is smart to make you smart as well. Oof. That was so good.
It's so true, too.
And then Gaiman wrote in an essay about Wolfe. I've met too many of my heroes, and these days I avoid meeting the few I have left because the easiest way to stop having heroes is to meet them, or worse, have dinner with them. But Gene Wolfe remains a hero to me. He's just turned 80, looks after his wife Rosemary, and is still writing deep, complex, brilliant fiction that slips between genres. He's my hero because he keeps trying new ways of writing, and because he remains as kind and as patient with me as he was when I was almost a boy. He's the finest living American writer of science fiction and fantasy, possibly the finest living American writer. Most people haven't heard of him, and that doesn't bother Gene in the slightest. He just gets on with writing the next book.
It's awesome. Crazy that that's Neil.
So,
because Neil is huge.
Yeah, and I've
Super
also
big
heard
time.
Neil Gaiman talking about, and we'll address this more as we go along, but I've heard Neil Gaiman speak about Gene Wolfe and talk about the fact that Gene Wolfe taught him how to write so that a reader will gain as much or more pleasure from reading your book a second time.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
Which-
I will say Gene is more famous than you think because
Yeah, so there's another reason that Gene Wolfe, the actual thing that people
everybody knows Gene Wolfe.
like, here's his face right here on the Pringles can.
That's what
Because
it looks
his
like.
day job was he invented the machine that, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe he invented the machine that bakes the Pringles chips.
I believe bakes and then makes them that shape.
Yeah.
It's the
Yeah.
shape.
Yeah, it's
right?
like the machine that cooks them and shapes them so that they fit in these cans.
Yep.
And that's why his face is on the cans.
So if you want to read the first Gene Wolfe book, just go check out the manual too.
And to put a little
Pretty
bow
much
on
it.
it, though, I think on both kind of the quotes and Neil Gaiman and that, where I think Gene Wolfe's background as an engineer really informs the craftsmanship in his novels. His books are not machine-like, but there is a care and a thoughtfulness and a meticulousness to his storytelling that it feels like maybe someone with a different background would be more loosey-goosey. And again, you would also maybe hear me saying that and think his stories are going to be cold and lifeless, and that is the exact opposite.
Yeah, far from it.
They are full of life, but they are told with a precision and a clarity that I think it might be hard to find without maybe someone of that disposition. And then to kind of continue that Neil Gaiman quote that Stephen mentioned, and to maybe to shout out the Rereading Wolf podcast. Thank you guys. A Gene Wolfe story. It is often said you cannot read a Gene Wolfe story. You can only reread a Gene Wolfe story.
Yeah, there's truth to that. Yeah, no, it's remarkable how he broadcasts so much of what is going to happen throughout the rest of the story at the very beginning of his books.
Yep.
But it's impossible to know what he's saying without reading the book
Yeah,
first.
somehow he removes the clarifying points to everything.
But the thing that always amazes me with that is on the reread, he is saying so much that has new context. But when you read it the first time, while you don't know what's going on or what things mean, you don't really totally feel lost.
Yeah.
What he's saying doesn't make sense is maybe not the right way to say it, but it's like, you're not like, what is this guy talking about?
Was like something important is being said right here.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is, but I know that it is important and it's going to come up.
Yeah, and some of it sounds like just kind of vaguely flowery language, or someone like using metaphors and similes and this and that and the other just to kind of like make a point. And you're like, oh no, he was being very literal.
He was being very literal. Yeah, for real.
yeah,
And so, okay. Book of the New Sun
Yes.
is what started our book club.
Yes.
the very first thing we read.
I had bought Shadow and Claw, the duo, which is how they're published now most of the time, which is the first two books in the series. I had bought that after hearing Mike from Mike's Book Reviews, shout out Mike, on YouTube. He had talked about it, sounded cool, the artwork looked sick, so I bought it, and then it sat on my shelf for like 2 years. How did you hear about Wolfe, Daniel?
Because I heard about it from you. So.
Yeah.
I read a Twitter thread about it.
Nice.
from a guy, I think his handle is Sunny Slope Seeker. But he
like
wrote
into snowboarding or something.
Yeah, no, and his Avi is a little otter, but he writes I haven't actually seen him post much recently, but he writes literature threads. But I'd mostly seen him write about Tolkien, and they were usually interesting ideas about Tolkien. Like he wrote a very interesting and provocative thread on sort of like standing up for Denethor, and like him as an ancient king, and obviously he wasn't a king, but he wrote a thread on that. And again, even though I didn't totally agree with him, it was interesting and very thought provoking. And then he wrote a thread on Gene Wolfe in the Book of the New Sun and how important he was and how it's hard to find in bookstores. Although occasionally you'll run into a bookstore where they'll have kind of like a Gene Wolfe shrine. I've not been to a bookstore like that, although I would love to go. But and then in a similar thread he wrote about Mervyn Peake's Gormenghast, which I've read the first book of, which is also very good. So at that point I'd encountered some of this stuff, and I started to take because of his opinions on Tolkien. I was like, I feel like I can take this guy really seriously because he's very thoughtful about Tolkien. And I started with just downloading him on Audible, and ended up just being completely blown away and moved. And they were not what I expected at all, especially with them being called, the first one being called Shadow the Torturer, and then Book of the New Sun was hard for me to parse out, but I thought I was in store for a much more like gruesome and dark, although there is a lot of darkness in those stories, but I just thought I was getting I thought I was going to get something more like Warhammer 40K adjacent, but obviously written in the 80s, but something like space fights and darkness and blood and gore. And again, that stuff is there to some degree, but it is that is not the way I really think about those stories.
Which I believe I respect 40K. I've never played it, even though I'm a tabletop nerd. So I'm not sure exactly where this is, but I believe that there is a Terminus Est
interesting
reference in 40K. I think there's a Terminus Est sword or something in 40K. So there's some wolf nerds in Games Workshop.
And on that too, like, why does he always have a sword that's not actually like a sword? Like Wizard Knight and in Book of the Sun, it's like it's my weapon, but it's not like you think it would be.
Yeah, I like that. That's a good observation.
But that's the same as Pringles. It's a chip, but it's not like a chip you would think of.
Hey, there you go. So
you know
Sam, so you heard about Wolf because of Daniel.
Pretty much, yeah. I was along for the ride. And
Okay.
I think that the thought that I want to bring to the table right now about these and about him being an engineer, about the Pringles, about the swords, all of it is that the one problem I had, like, and not really a problem, but I guess I couldn't figure it out is like when we started talking in our book club, we were always talking about like, how could this be a movie? How could this be a show? But when we're reading or thinking about Gene Wolfe, we're like, it can't. For any of it. And I think that is truly astounding about him as an author, is that he truly is an author and nothing else. His stories will not apply or make sense in any other medium other than just read this.
So that's
read it again and again, and then maybe you'll get it. Because the way it's revealed, the way that things come across, and I don't want to be a spoiler, but the reason I'm convinced of that is because of a chapter about a creature that he created called the Alzabo, and how that whole thing comes across and how it unfolds and where it's placed in the story and in its context. I can't get the picture out of my head, and he just described a picture, but it's so like it's going to be different than your picture. You know what I mean? It's just,
it's about as close to unadaptable as possible.
Right, which is offensive to me in general, because I want to be able to see that come to life in some way. But I do agree with it at this stage.
It is funny where like I'm almost positive that if someone adapted it, I would despise it. But there is a part of me that like wishes someone would try. But,
well, what's interesting and what ties into our last conversation on the pod was what we did kind of agree with on. So thus far, we've read Book of the New Sun and we've read Wizard Knight, and we'll touch on both of those in more detail. But what we've discussed with both of those is that the only way that I can see them working, and I think us as a group, would be an anime, not a live action show.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think kind of going off of some things that we talked about, there is some creative license in that medium that would lend itself to a Wolfian story. But there's so many things in Book of the New Sun, especially that like if you see it kind of ruins the reread value and the way that things fall into place.
It would have to be very artfully told or very skillfully told if they were going to try to keep that level of mystery going.
Yeah.
And again, and honestly, especially like in modern like TV making and or filmmaking, that level of craftsmanship is not always present in the kind of big budget productions we're seeing these days.
No,
not that there's lots of good things being made, but something like you would need like a David Lynch doing it or some,
but even then, right? Because and that's what makes the statement.
Son would be insane though. By the way,
it would
like,
be,
and not in a good way. I don't
know.
I'm just saying, like someone being very specific with the way. I mean, honestly, it would be like an early Christopher Nolan film almost,
or like Denis Villeneuve.
Yeah.
Now, as far as like big budget directors, but I don't think that there's any. I don't think that there's any such thing as a completely unadaptable story. There's probably a way to do it, but I don't know what it is.
So in this I think if you did a almost True Detective season 1 framing device of the interview for Book of the New Sun, you could almost do it, which is a good time to mention that many of Gene Wolfe's stories, if not most, are there is a literary artifice or artifact to the work where you are reading, and for Book of the New Sun, this is revealed instantly, but the book is a memoir written by a character in the world, the Severian which you're following. And Gene Wolfe often uses that trope of either a journal or a memoir, or it is written by someone in world. So there are multiple layers of meaning going on.
And it's unreliable narrator.
And
which is
Severian is I think the most unreliable narrator that I've ever read.
Yeah,
but that's the impossible part of making it into. But the only way I could see this happen, and talk about being the greatest author of all time, write a book so good no one else can make anything out of it.
I know. Like,
no
kidding.
That to
no
me,
kidding.
like that's one. The second part about this is if we were to see an adaptation, I think Gene Wolfe would have to write the screenplay.
Yeah, I know. And he's dead.
He's dead.
So
R.I.P.
that's not going to happen.
No.
I mean, unless we can summon him somehow. I mean, Conan
right? There we go. But no, it part of the thing that makes it so impossible to adapt is that it is a memoir, and the fact that it's a memoir is a very important part of the entire process.
Right, not like Lord of the Rings, where it's Frodo's memoir, but that's not super important.
Well, I was actually going to say, I'm pretty sure the reason Gene Wolfe writes that way is because of Lord of the Rings. Because Lord of the Rings, even though most people skip the introduction and don't think of it this way, they think of it as just the story. The Lord of the Rings is allegedly a historical artifact, and Tolkien gives us this whole preface about how he found this book and he translated this book, where what we're reading is Tolkien's supposed translations of a language called Westron, which we don't get really any examples of, although we do know some words of, so that the actual names, and he talked about this in other things that Tolkien wrote, the names of the characters are not the right names. That they actually have other names, and he just sort of used these names because he thought they would translate the reality of those names to us better. Which, honestly, you can kind of apply a Gene Wolfe lens to The Lord of the Rings if you want to, and it's actually kind of fun to think about, even though I think The Lord of the Rings is an accurate telling of the events. I don't think there's
no unreliable narrator.
But it is interesting to think about, wait a minute, the hobbits that destroyed the ring wrote us a book about the ring, and you're kind of like, this is kind of...
the winners write history.
I mean, no, it's true.
Let's hear what the orcs have to say.
It's true to some degree that there's something kind of interesting going on there. Gene Wolfe clearly, I think very clearly, and obviously because he's written and talked about how much he loved the Lord of the Rings, took that idea, and while Tolkien was giving us a story very on its face, while adding all these translated bits and talking about the history, because Tolkien, and I think we'd mentioned this in another episode, Tolkien loved histories real and imagined. Mm-hmm. So he couldn't think of Lord of the Rings as anything other than an imagined history. Gene Wolfe does not always do exactly that, but he wants to place what he's writing in a real context. Where another book of his that I haven't quite read yet, but I do know a little about, called Sorcerer's House, that book is a series of letters. So all of the books are a letter to someone else, and then their story is revealed that way. Some of the letters are short and long. So like that, there's not necessarily always. Some of his short stories don't do this, but especially his novels, there is usually someone in the world also telling the story and communicating it, and then also the story is you're not just hearing the story, what happened, you are getting the story from that person's perspective.
Well, and Wizard Night is a letter also.
Absolutely. It is. It's I feel like it's both a letter and a journal.
Yeah. But it's, even the journal parts are being sent to...
They are being sent to someone.
To Ben.
To his brother, yes.
Which is not a spoiler because he literally, I think that's the first word of the book is Ben.
Well, yeah, in the chapter.
I mean, it is...
The character.
Yeah.
The character list.
Inside of this, and not to be a spoiler, it is one of the funniest things about... And I do think Gene Wolfe is way funnier than Tolkien. And Tolkien was great and a genius, but not nearly as funny as Gene.
No.
Gene Wolfe has an amazing
and
sense of
the
humor.
Wizard Knight, like something crazy is happening with magic and stuff, and then he's like, and this, Ben, I can't even tell you what happened next, bro, because that was the most wild thing that I've ever done. Anyways, then we went down to, the lower world, and he goes on to all this stuff. His just breaking the third wall with that is so funny to me.
One thing I wanted to point out that I love about Wolfe's writing, we've already touched on the concept of the unreliable narrator, which if you're not familiar with that, just to flesh it out a little bit, it's a first person usually perspective where the person that is telling you the story is maybe not telling you the truth is kind of the long and short of it.
Imagine every presidential campaign in the past.
Yeah.
It's
it's maybe it's propaganda, maybe they're misremembering, but what I find so fascinating and what speaks to his genius as a writer, again, I've only read Book of the New Sun and Wizard Night. I know he has one other trilogy. I'm forgetting what it's called, Daniel, but it's the Greek. This is a separate story, but it's his
Soldier
Greek
of
fantasy.
Yeah.
He
has a Greek fantasy.
But so there's
Soldier
three
in the Mist, and they're amazing.
But there's these three main characters. There's these three main characters that are specifically unreliable narrators, but all three of them, they're each unreliable for vastly different reasons.
Yep.
Which is, that he wrote, not just writing completely different stories and different voices for each of the narrators, but also giving them completely different reasons to be unreliable.
Yes.
It's just fascinating. And so, I don't want to just sit here and gush, but it's
it's hard not to.
It's hard not to. And
I feel like everybody that likes him is super gushy, though. Imagine you create a character that then creates all the characters, and that's kind of what this is.
So, Daniel, real quick, since you kicked us off with this, could you give us just a very brief and spoiler-free kind of not synopsis, but the pitch for Book of the New Sun?
Yeah, so starting with Book of the New Sun.
Dumbledore dies, no spoiler.
Womp womp.
So Book of the New Sun is a memoir written by Severian, who is the main character. And at the time of writing the book that you're reading, he reveals to us at the very beginning that he is now the autarch, which is the ruler of the world. So you get that information, and then you find out that he is writing you kind of the story of his life, or the most important bits, which is mostly the story of him becoming the ruler. And it starts with him as a torturer's apprentice. It's kind of
not
best
in line for the throne at all.
No. He is just nobody, an orphan who was taken in by the Torturers Guild and trained to be a torturer. And the books. So you get a little bit of this is going to end up with Severian being the ruler of this world, but he's starting out as much of a nobody basically as possible. Okay, so you're getting, how does that happen? And Severian telling that story, and then in general, I think it's actually good to not know a ton about the setting, but it is the far future vaguely is something that
a galaxy far, far away.
Yeah, basically, but not long ago. A long time from now.
A very, very long time.
In a galaxy
from now.
right here, basically. Yeah. But
it's good. It's hard to give. It's hard to give too much of a pitch.
It's honestly funny though, because it's kind of an unspoilable book in some ways.
In some ways, it is. One fun thing I'll say.
Even knowing everything, I'm like, I still need to reread that.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely a science fiction book, but it's a perfect example of. You could call it sci-fantasy if you want, but it of a story that, because of the way the setting is put up, even though on its face it's a science fiction story, it definitely straddles that line between science fiction and fantasy, and is kind of a great example of why like maybe that line doesn't need to exist in a lot of cases.
Yeah, don't get me started on genre BS.
Well, and I think that was started to give some credit to one of Gene Wolfe's major influences, Jack Vance's Dying Earth series was a major inspiration for Book of the New Sun, which I think is okay to say, which is more explicitly from the beginning a series written in the very far future where the world's kind of falling apart. And again, in those stories, we've got high technology that's basically indiscernible from magic, alongside basically like completely, devastated populations, to where you've got this mix of incredibly luxurious and powerful and societies and beings, alongside things that are totally, totally wanton and basically like medieval peasants on some things. And so like Book of the New Sun is absolutely kind of operating in that space, a society that's fallen apart and really on its last legs and really struggling, and that's sort of the background, which I think knowing that's probably actually helpful going into it.
Yeah.
But then Gene Wolfe is not doing Vance; he's doing his own thing, but it's very much riffing on that idea.
And then Wizard Knight, I'll take Wizard Knight if you don't mind.
Yeah, please.
Wizard Knight, he wrote much more recent Book of the New Sun was in the 80s.
Yeah, it came out. The first one came out in 80, and the last published in 82.
Yeah. Wizard Knights came out in 2004.
2000, I think 3 and 4.
Yeah, 3 and because it was split. He wrote it as one, and it got published as
That's
two.
That's the year
as two
Finding
books.
Nemo came out.
Yep. That's weird.
Isn't that weird? We just watched that tonight, so
nice. So Wizard Knight is kind of the classic kind of fish out of water story.
Yeah.
Kind of Connecticut and King Arthur's court kind of idea. Young boy dropped into a new world, and then it kind of turns into this coming of age knightly quest story. And I don't want to go too much further into it than that, even though it's kind of a hard thing to spoil. But that one, man, the both of them, I was hooked from the beginning with Wolfe, but there was something about Wizard Knight that got me.
yeah.
Yeah, it's very special because of the
World building.
And I think we've talked about this, and we even talked in the Sword and Sorcery bit and talking about Robert E. Howard, that the gray and complex characters, even though actually now that I say that, I don't know if Conan's a complex character. He's kind of just exactly what he is. But in that world, there are gray characters which are capable of being good and bad, and I haven't. There's lots of great storytelling with that sort of nuance. One of the things that's amazing about and feels refreshing now about Wizard Knight is just the unequivocal love of honor and doing the right thing, and just the absolute moral clarity in those moments. It is so refreshing.
I agree.
To read.
Yeah, no, and I think that's part of what struck me was that, Abel he doesn't always succeed.
No.
But he only ever tries to do the right thing.
Yes. And there is sometimes he's not sure what the right thing to do is, which that's the struggle.
Yeah.
But he will, without a doubt, do the right thing. And also, sometimes because he is an American boy transplanted to this medieval world, he often doesn't know the customs and the times. And he gets both himself and his friends into trouble. There's a very notable story where he has acquired a friend that he considers his friend who is of a servant class, and gets them both into a bunch of trouble because he won't not call the man his friend in front
Right.
of others.
Yeah.
Where Abel is going to do the right thing, but then he learns also, well, hey, wait a minute, I need
Yeah,
to be,
sometimes
I need
the
to be
right-
careful. I need to be
sometimes the
careful
right
the way I
thing
talk
is-
about this.
Yeah.
The right thing is not the right thing for other people. Which, I think that's Gene riffing on the, just the humanistic idea that right and wrong is kind of ambiguous, but also kind of not.
Yeah, it's both.
At the same time, based on your setting and culture, kind of being everyone's friend seems great, but in this cultural setting, it's not okay.
So this doesn't come up in Wizard Night specifically, but there are a few things with Gene Wolfe as well where his stories always feel fresh, but there are clear tropes that come up or things where
Like the sword, not sword?
the sword not sword is one
Yeah.
of them, both terminus est and a turn. But then one of the interesting ones I
Well,
think
and sword
is,
breaker more than a turn.
Yeah, well that's fair.
Yeah.
Is that there are and this doesn't actually come up in Wizard Night as much, but there are a lot of storytelling and storytelling competitions in his stories where a character in his story is telling another story. And then there are also in his things, there's very often an exchange of information, and one character says, "Well, you tell me this," and it says, "Well, I'll only tell you that if you tell me this," and then they often will be like, "Well, I'll tell you two things if you tell me the one thing," but then very often no one ever says the second thing they were going to tell you,
Right.
which is very, very Gene Wolfe. But what's funny is somehow he manages to do those things often in his stories, but it also never feels tiresome. It always sort of makes sense in the world, but there are lots of little fun tropes and moments like that. One thing I'll also say that's really interesting is that reading Gene Wolfe and then reading anything else is always a shock.
It's like having to, if you go up into outer space or if you go way down in the ocean, you have to have X amount of time in a hyperbaric chamber to get your feet back under you, or you'll get,
You got to get quarantined first.
Your blood will explode.
We've followed up Gene Wolfe stories with other very good, even very well written stories.
Yeah,
and
truly.
It is still an adjustment where Wolfe is singular,
like the whiskey,
like the whiskey that we're drinking,
to where anything is just lacking a certain level of complexity. He also, the one thing I will say, and to say other stories are lacking complexity is not really fair. But the one thing that he does that's different is he also just crams so much stuff into his stories.
Well, that's why there's complex and then there's Wolfe.
Yes, no, that's very fair.
And it's hard to even describe because there's not really a. Maybe there exists in some corners of the literary world, like classic literature.
Sure.
Maybe there are some better comparisons.
Yeah.
But in what I've read, and I've read a fair amount of classical literature, I've not encountered the same thing. So it's hard to kind of even reference. Oh, it's like this. It's like this. It's Wolfe.
Yeah.
It's Gene Wolfe. So
he's the only author we've read to date that I'm I am 100% going to need to reread this, and when I reread it, it's gonna be like reading it for the first time again.
Yeah, and he's one of the not
I have
the
no doubt.
only.
Even knowing everything that's gonna happen, I'm going to catch different things. It's gonna be.
But he's
reading it all over again, first time.
Well, and he's one of the only authors that we've read so far that I don't just want. I know for a fact that I will read everything that he ever wrote.
Yeah.
It's going. That's just how it's going to be.
Yep.
And I will. I think I anticipate loving every word of it.
Yep.
Just a wildly unique writer.
One thing that's interesting too on that note is we were also talking. This is somewhat circling back to the unreliable narrator talk. Is a series that we haven't read as a group, which I won't mention what it is yet. Gene Wolfe manages to have an unreliable third-person narrator.
Oh my god! Of course he does. Of course.
And there is Gene Wolfe also wrote in some versions of the book. There is an intentional typo that got corrected, and he was very mad. But he intentionally wrote a typo that is very, very important.
Oh,
and he was
wow.
really mad. But it got fixed. But it was an intentional error. that he wrote into a book. And again,
I mean,
it's like,
okay,
it's
so
next level.
Wolfe, man.
Okay, listen, all right, and
He was so mad. He was like, "Oh no!"
And now I'm gonna shit on Gene Wolfe a bit. Like, if that is something that is important to you, you say that to whoever your editor is.
Well, no, and I that's the thing.
that is so not.
Well,
fair.
and hold on,
No,
he may have. We
Speaking as the
know.
editor of this podcast, I'm like, if you're gonna have a really important typo,
Well, hold on, he may
you're
have-
gonna communicate.
He
guess
probably
it was,
did,
I
and then
think
there was some copy editor whose job it was to
who
catch
said
the typos.
that's what it was.
That it never made
Yes.
it to them.
right? And
that-
so let's assume Gene Wolfe is a saint, can do no wrong, but.
So his
What if he
fucking
wasn't?
editor should have said it to that poor copy editor whose job was to catch all the there, and theirs.
I mean, yeah.
Exactly.
If the copy editor was doing that, then props to that copy editor, man. Getting in there, correcting
right.
the dotting the I's and
love our
crossing the
editors.
T's. I'm just saying, and that's the only bad thing I
I don't
have to say
know.
about
I don't
Gene.
know if the I need to check again though. The version I have, it is correct in the audiobook version does the typo correctly.
Oh, fascinating, interesting.
But because I think it came out later and he was like, hey, because he was at that point like, this is
Do
supposed to be
this.
way. But I don't know if I think the Tor or maybe no, I have an Orb. Is it Orb or Orbit? Yeah, no, Orb. The Orb version I have, I believe, does not contain the.
So
contains
hopefully
the
the
typo.
newer printings have
I
the
hope
typo.
so.
Well, we'll find that out. I was saying to you the other day, Daniel, an interesting comparison that popped into my head, and maybe the best comparison to Wolfe that I've been able to figure out, has nothing to do with literature, but this is not a direct one-to-one comparison. This is mostly just a how Stephen feels comparison.
The most important, in my opinion.
Thank you. There's a feeling that I have with Gene Wolfe that I think the only other time that I can like put a finger on would be when I got Tom Waits.
Yeah.
And I'm not really sure even how to describe it, but it's something about a singular talent,
Yeah.
an utterly unique voice,
Yeah.
a method to the madness that is not just unique, but hard to maybe grasp at first until there's that moment of that click that happens.
Yep.
Was it Waltzing Matilda?
So I got closing time. My music teacher, well, all of our music teacher, Bob Grant. He gave us.
God, that guy.
He gave me closing time.
I would let him join the book club.
I would too. I love that man.
Yeah.
But he gave me closing time. And I remember listening to it several times and then having to put it away for a minute because, like, I know that this is amazing. I'm not ready for it. And then a couple years later, I think Jonathan Walsh gave me Rain Dogs for my birthday.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was when it clicked, and I just became obsessed.
Yeah.
Does that have
And-
Step Right Up on it?
Step Right Up is on closing time.
Okay, never
Yep.
mind. Great song, though.
But anyway, so it's an out there comparison. Again, it's really just a Stephen's feelings thing. But Tom Waits is one of my favorite musicians of all time, favorite songwriters of all time, favorite artists of all time.
Yeah.
And Gene Wolfe is on that same level and gives me some of the same feelings of like this is something that is truly not just truly unique, but truly special and deeply meaningful to me as a human being.
No, I think
That's like a perfect articulation. I think. Like honestly, I'm gonna take that too because
it's unique, it's masterful, it's
One of a kind.
also niche, which Wolfe
Truly.
is writing in a niche way. It's like because it's sword and sorcery, and or fantasy and sci-fi and all. It's genre fiction.
like you have to try a little bit.
That writes a lot of people.
You have to
off,
try.
and then not all of, but you know, just from the way Tom Waits sings, there's just like a lot of people just are like not gonna do it.
Yeah. Yep.
That's what I'm saying. You have to like try to like see it.
But Waits is a master in his craft and doing something very unique and special, and has also reinvented himself multiple times.
Yes, that's an excellent point as well.
Which and Wolfe has managed to do something similar where he has just kind of managed to say, relevant and doing something unique and interesting and special across a lot of different types of writing.
Yeah.
Oh, and very interestingly, also, even that Waits is still with us, which is wonderful, but a very similar timeline of their writing. And
Truly.
works.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Starting around the same time.
Wolfe was writing a little earlier in the 60s. And then Tom Waits really gets going at the very end of the 60s, but then their careers kind of run parallel for most of the time since. But
I was saying Closing Time. Closing Time is Tom Waits' first album. It was
Tom Trotter's Blues.
Yeah, that album. Why I can never remember the name of that.
That's Matilda.
That's
That's what it's on. But
Small Change.
Small Change. Thank you.
Tom Trotter's Blues is the song.
Small Change is the album.
Small Change is the song.
Yep.
Which Closing Time is also
Closing
good.
Time is unbelievable.
Closing
Martha
Time
is one of the most heartbreaking songs I've ever heard in my life.
It's a little more of just crooning. It's actually the most like normal singing.
Yeah, it's the most accessible album probably.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, but that was that. I'm glad that I caught that and we corrected this because that would have bugged the hell out of me.
Yes. So when we
Small
reread
Change
this,
was the
we
album.
should listen to Tom
It probably would work. So anyways, one final little bit that I'd like to toss out there for anybody who's listening to this that isn't is maybe interested in reading some of these things that we've talked about, but isn't super familiar with science fiction and fantasy. Conan, I think, is a great introduction to the genre of fantasy. I think it's Tower of the Elephant is one of the best things I've ever read, period, hands down. It's easy to get into, it's easy to follow, it's a great jumping off point if you want to get into fantasy. We don't mean this at all in any sort of a gatekeeping way. Gene Wolfe is not beginner science fiction or fantasy. You can go into it, and if, like we were talking about this before the episode started, I think if you are if you're really into reading classical literature and you've read a lot of the like really dense classical literature,
if you've read Dickens and you like
if you've read Dickens, if you've read Melville, stuff like that,
you're gonna be fine.
You're gonna be fine. But if you're just getting into reading and you're just getting into science fiction and fantasy,
if you just learned how to read, probably.
Yeah, if you're in first, second, third grade, maybe wait on Wolf for a little bit. It'll still be there, and it'll just be just as amazing.
I don't mean to be crass. You're probably very intelligent.
But for real, it's intermediate to advanced level sci-fi and fantasy, and it's well worth the journey, and cannot recommend him enough. So final thoughts. Sam suggested Conan versus Sir Abel. Sir Abel being the lead character from Wizard Knight, and we're going to be not spoilery. We're just going to talk about it. Mano y mano.
So I would say that they have their signature weapons, though. Yes,
they have their signature weapons, which we're not going to get into detail about what those do.
Conan does not have his little like sexy sash either.
No sexy sash.
Just a classic sword. So it's on the
and this is Abel without his like whole like list of like
he doesn't have his
Pokemon
bros.
that he can
There's
call
no
out.
bros.
Yeah.
No bros.
He doesn't have his Pokemon arsenal he can call out. I choose
He's collecting
you.
Pokemon. Okay, so I'm pondering this, and it's hard for me to imagine Conan losing, even once Abel has the C in him, which I don't think is a spoiler, and he's strong at a different level. Well, I guess
what if we took it to just arm wrestling and no like murder?
That's a good point.
Because Conan dying doesn't seem possible.
Well, I was going to say let's continue with your thoughts because I have some thoughts
on,
kind of
Daniel,
along that line.
I guess the big thing is I would say is that Abel in the Knight gets beaten. Abel in the Wizard probably doesn't.
Probably.
Like after he's Abel.
After he's we'll call him Abel.
Yeah,
after he's like Abel.
Yeah.
Abel of the
I
High
think
Heart.
that,
Abel.
What I would say though, Sam, did you have any final thoughts on this?
I have a bunch of BS to share, but go on.
Share away.
Everything
please.
I have to say does not matter.
Okay. Well then, Mike here. Yeah. I think that the way that this would go, I think Daniel, you hit the nail on the head. Depending on which book we're talking, he wins or loses.
Wizard, yeah.
I do think though that, let's say Wizard, I think Abel squeaks out a victory.
Yeah.
And then I honestly think that they become friends.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that.
I don't think that he necessarily...
Or both die.
I don't think he becomes one of Abel's Pokemon, as Sam put it.
Yeah.
But I do think that I think that they have a friendly relationship and work together.
We should also say that this is assuming not a knightly battle in the Wizard.
Just a brawl.
Because Conan would waste him in jousting. Not Conan.
Abel would waste Conan
for
absolutely. For sure.
For sure.
This is just assuming
this is a melee.
Yeah, yes.
Which wait,
Or
actually,
quarterstaffs would have been
stop.
Yep.
That whole setup is literally unfair, leaning on Conan's side.
No,
Like,
I mean,
let's
I
put
agree.
Conan in a context where he needs to call some Pokemon. He needs to joust, and you know what? Conan is screwed because he is one-track mind. Does not play well with others type of dude, unless we're talking about old Conan. But even those guys betrayed him.
I mean, if we're being...
Abel is more well-rounded in terms of
if we're including their entire ouvre, like Conan is a king, so he can rally an entire nation's army.
But that's out of like fear and command, not Abel with his like these guys support me because of honor. I can't pay you, but will you fight for me?
I mean, that's fair.
Yes.
That's fair. But I do think Conan's subjects are known to love him.
Oh, come on.
In the end, they do.
Say
no.
I mean, it's
Conan says that they love him.
I mean, fair enough.
Talk about unreliable. They love me.
This
I'm
has been
awesome.
another episode of the Undertowers podcast. I'm
you,
Steven,
guys.
He's Daniel, he's Sam. You can find us on all of the social media bullshits and YouTube at Undertowers podcast. Follow Hole Dweller.
Yes, big thank you to Hole Dweller.
Read
and our
Conan.
sponsors, the Supple Live.
Yeah, be supple.
And
be lithe.
Thank you to Black Coast.
Our first sponsor
Black
of the
Coast
podcast.
Shapewear. Thank you to Black Coast Shapewear.
I cannot wait to wear the hell out of that.
Read Conan, read Wolfe. Cheers, boys. Namarie.
Cheers.
We love y'all. See you next time.